So you want to own an airport. You buy a big flat field near a city, you lay down a runway, you put up a terminal, and then you sit back while the world's airlines pay you rent every single time a plane kisses your tarmac. Hundreds of flights a day, tens of thousands of travelers, every one of them paying just to pass through your building. It looks like you've bought a toll bridge that the entire planet is forced to cross. Now here's the part that should stop you cold. Heathrow is the busiest airport in Europe. In a normal year, it moves around 80 million people. And on its core business, the planes, the landings, the passenger fees, Heathrow loses money. The airport has said so, out loud, to its own regulator. It runs at a loss while the airlines flying through it turn a profit. So why, at the end of 2024, did a French private equity firm and Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund pay billions to buy a chunk of it in a deal that valued the airport at £8.66 billion? Why does some of the smartest money on earth fight to own a business that loses money on the very thing it's famous for? By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what they were buying, because it is not the thing painted on the side of the building. An airport is not really a transport business. It's a landlord, arguably the most powerful landlord in any city, and its real product was never the flights, it's the crowd. The planes are just a conveyor belt that delivers a very specific kind of customer to your doorstep. Someone with money in their pocket, 2 or 3 hours to kill, no way to leave, and nothing to do but wander past your shops. Everything that actually makes money happens in that stretch after they land and before they board. The runway is the bait. The terminal is the trap. Let's start with what it costs to get in, because there are really 3 completely different businesses hiding under one word. At the small end sits the regional airport, a single runway, a modest terminal, a few dozen flights a day serving a town or a county. Little airfields like this change hands quietly for a few $1,000,000, sometimes less. And in the United States, there are private airstrips you can buy outright for the price of a nice house. No scheduled flights, no crowds, just a strip of asphalt and a license. In the middle is the proper regional hub, millions of passengers a year, a real terminal, real retail. Now you're talking hundreds of millions to build or buy. And then there's the top of the market, the global mega hub, where you usually can't buy the whole thing at all. You buy a slice. When Ferrovial sold most of its Heathrow stake in 2024, the buyers were Ardian, a French private equity fund, and the public investment fund, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth arm. Together, they took nearly 38% of the airport's parent company. And here's the detail that tells you everything. On Ferrovial's own books, the value of its Heathrow stake had been written down to zero. Yet that stake sold for billions. That's the gap between what an airport looks like on a spreadsheet and what it's actually worth to someone who understands it. Which raises the real question. Why do private equity firms and the sovereign wealth funds of Qatar, Singapore, and Saudi Arabia keep buying airports instead of the airlines that fly to them? Because an airport is a monopoly on a piece of geography. London has exactly one Heathrow. Everyone who wants to fly through the busiest hub in Europe has to come through your doors, at your prices. Airlines compete with each other, race each other to the bottom on fares, merge and go bankrupt. The airport just sits there, the only one of its kind, collecting from all of them. So how does it actually make money? There are 2 official ways, and then there's the shadow economy that nobody puts in the brochure. The first official stream is aeronautical revenue, the money from planes. An airline pays to land, pays to park at a gate, and pays a passenger charge that's quietly baked into the price of every ticket you've ever bought. Globally, this is the bigger slice on paper, a little over half of all airport revenue. And it is also, for many big airports, barely enough to cover the cost of the building. This is where you learn a brutal lesson about who actually holds the power. At a regulated airport like Heathrow, you don't even get to set your own landing fees. A government regulator does. Heathrow wanted to charge airlines around £40 per passenger. The airlines, British Airways, Virgin, Delta, pushed for under 20. The regulator split it and forced the charge down to about £25, then trimmed it further toward 23. Now do the arithmetic on that fight. A swing of a single pound per passenger across 80 million passengers is £80 million a year. The entire aeronautical business comes down to a lobbying war with a regulator over pennies per head multiplied by tens of millions of heads. Which is why the real money lives in the second stream, non-aeronautical revenue, the stuff that has nothing to do with planes. Globally, it's around 37% of airport income, but at the big international hubs, it climbs far higher, nearly half of all revenue in the Middle East. And the beautiful thing about it, from the owner's chair, is that the airport mostly sells none of it directly. It rents. You think about what an airport actually is once a passenger clears security. It's a shopping mall where the customers can't leave, can't drive somewhere cheaper, and have hours of dead time to fill. So the airport doesn't run the shops. It leases the floor space to duty-free operators and brands, and it structures the rent in the most ruthless way imaginable. When the Spanish operator ANA put its duty-free concessions out to tender, the largest such tender in the world, covering 27 airports and expected to move around 18 billion euros of sales over 12 years, the rent wasn't just a share of sales. It was built on a minimum annual guarantee, a floor the retailer has to pay the airport, regardless of whether business is good, bad, or non-existent. The pandemic proved the point perfectly. When the shops sat empty, that guarantee only ever protected one party, the airport landlord. The retailer eats the risk. The airport collects either way. Then there's parking, one of the quietest gold mines in the whole operation, where a week in a lot near the terminal can cost more than the flight itself. It's captive market pricing at its purest. The traveler running late for a 6 a.m. departure is not going to drive around comparing rates, and the airport knows it. There's advertising on every surface your eyes land on. There are the kiosks planted in the middle of the walkway, paying enormous rent per square foot precisely because they sit in the path of every human being who passes. And there's ground transport, which is turning into its own toll booth. In early 2026, Los Angeles International tripled the fee it charges Uber and Lyft, from around $4 a trip to as much as $12 in the central terminal area, the first change in over a decade. That one move is expected to bring in roughly $100 million in its first full year, funneled straight into a $30 billion rebuild. Every ride to or from that airport now pays the airport a cut, whether the passenger ever notices or not. And then there's the shadow economy, the strangest revenue lever in aviation, and one the airport barely lifts a finger for. It's the market in slots. A slot is simply the right to land or take off in a specific window of time, and at a full airport those windows are finite. Heathrow is capped at about 10,500 aircraft movements a week and runs at roughly 99% of capacity, which means new slots almost never come free. So back in 1999, a UK court ruling made something possible that exists almost nowhere else. Airlines can buy and sell slots to each other on a secondary market, and the prices are absurd. In 2016, Oman Air paid $75 million for a single prime early morning slot pair, bought from Kenya Airways. American Airlines has spent tens of millions more building its own Heathrow foothold. Airlines have even issued bonds backed by their slots. Virgin Atlantic once raised £220 million against its Heathrow rights. There's a reason those slots get hoarded so fiercely. The rule that governs them is brutally simple. Use a slot at least around 80% of the time, and it's yours to keep next season. Fall below that, and it drops back into a pool to be handed to someone else. So airlines guard them like family heirlooms. During slow stretches, some have flown near empty planes into congested airports for no commercial reason at all, purely to burn the required takeoffs and stop a valuable slot from slipping away. A flight carrying almost no one, losing money on every leg, existing only to defend a landing right worth tens of millions of dollars. That's how much a sliver of an airport's runway can be worth, even to someone who will never own the airport. Here's the twist. When one airline pays another $75 million for a slot, the airport itself receives nothing from that sale, not a penny. And yet it's one of the most valuable things the airport owns, because it's evidence. The airport walks into the regulator's office, points at a $75 million slot trade, and says, "Look how badly airlines want access to my runway. Demand is outrunning supply. Let me raise the passenger charge." A trade the airport wasn't even part of becomes the argument that lets it charge everyone more. So far, the airport sounds like a machine that prints money from every direction at once. Now the other side of the ledger. And it's heavier than it looks. An airport is a monster of fixed costs. A large hub burns through as much electricity as a small city, running lights, screens, heating, cooling, and baggage systems around the clock. It employs thousands of people. It carries enormous insurance, endless security, and a maintenance bill that never sleeps. And almost none of that flexes with how many passengers actually show up. That's the trap hiding under the whole business, and 2020 detonated it in full view. When the pandemic grounded the world, Airport passenger traffic didn't dip. It fell off a cliff, down by roughly two-thirds globally. And here's the number that matters. The world's airports lost more than $111 billion of revenue in 2020 alone, around 65% of what they'd expected to earn. In the United States, airports bled close to $14 billion. But the runway still had to be lit, the controllers still had to be paid, the buildings still had to be secured, insured, heated, and kept legally ready to operate. For 2,000 passengers a day instead of 200,000, you cannot put an airport on pause. The revenue is almost entirely a function of traffic, and traffic can collapse overnight, but the cost base barely moves. That's the fragility the flashing departure boards never show you. A mostly empty airport costs nearly as much to run as a full one. This is the structural truth underneath the whole business, and it's exactly why the ownership looks the way it does. The airline is the fragile part of the system. Thin margins, brutal competition, one fuel spike or one recession away from the wall. The airport is the durable part, but only if it's big enough and busy enough to defend that monopoly through a bad decade. That's why sovereign wealth funds buy Heathrow and not British Airways. The airline competes for customers every single day. The airport owns the door those customers have to walk through, and a door is a much better thing to own than a race. And this is what makes an airport such a strange, powerful business once you see it clearly. It gets paid from both ends of the same transaction. It charges the traveler through the shops, the parking, the rideshare fee, the passenger charge folded quietly into the ticket. And it charges the airline, the middleman who delivers that traveler to the door in the first place, for the privilege of dropping them off. Almost nothing else works this way. A shopping mall pays to attract shoppers. An airport gets the airlines to pay for the right to bring them. The customer is captive, and the supplier of customers is captive too, because the runways they need only exist in a handful of places on Earth. You sit in the middle, collecting from both. So let's add it all up and answer the real question. What do you actually make? Take the small version first. A regional airport for a few $1,000,000. The revenue from its handful of flights and its modest little shops roughly matches what it costs to keep the lights on and the runway certified. In a good year, you clear a thin profit. In a slow one, you're near break-even or slightly under. You don't buy an airport at this level for the cash flow. You buy it for the land, the operating license, the business park you can build around it, and the long bet that the city eventually sprawls out to meet your runway. As an industry, airports globally earn a return on invested capital of only about 6%, which sits below what it costs them to raise that capital in the first place. This is not, at the small end, a fountain of easy money. The medium hub is a different animal. Billions to build or buy, but a real one can pull close to $1 billion a year in total revenue, and after the enormous costs of running it, clear a few $100 million in profit, as long as the passengers keep coming and the regulator keeps letting you charge. And the mega hub, you don't buy outright, you buy a slice, the way Ardian and the Saudis bought into Heathrow. But a slice of a monopoly on 80 million captive travelers a year can quietly out-earn an entire small airport you own outright. It all comes down to one thing, the same thing it always comes down to in this business: whether the regulator finally approves the passenger charge you've been fighting for. So if you ever do decide to buy an airport, hold on to the one fact that survives all the noise. You are not buying planes. You are not buying flights. You are not even really buying travel. You're buying the single unavoidable doorway between a person and the sky. And unlike the airlines that crowd through it, competing and merging and dying, the door doesn't move, doesn't compete, and doesn't go anywhere. It just stands there, the only one of its kind, and charges everyone who needs to pass. Own the door, and you own all of them.